Many years ago, in the peaceful town of Agbo, lived a man named Runo. Runo was a man blessed beyond measure. He came from humble beginnings and had risen to become one of the wealthiest businessmen in town. He owned several successful companies, from real estate to oil and technology. People often said that he had the golden touch because every business he invested in flourished and every risk he took paid off. However, despite his success, Runo was different from other billionaires. He didn't chase after luxury or worldly pleasures. He lived in a beautiful mansion, drove a few expensive cars, and had a personal chef. But his greatest treasure was his faith. He believed that everything he had belonged to God. Many people admired him, not just for his wealth, but for his humility and devotion to God. He never missed church service. He donated generously to the church, and above all, he remained a faithful husband to his beloved wife, Mimi. Mimi was everything Runo prayed for in a wife. She was beautiful, humble, kind, and deeply rooted in faith. She grew up in a Christian home, raised by God-fearing parents who taught her the importance of prayer, obedience, and righteousness. So, when she married Runo, she was glad that she was not just marrying a rich man, she was marrying a man of faith. From the moment they said their marital vows, they had one goal: to build a marriage centered on God. Every morning, they woke up early and knelt together in prayer. At night too, before going to bed, they held hands and thanked God for another day. Their love was pure, strong, and steadfast, just as their faith. And they believed that nothing would ever come between them. But what they did not know was that their faith and love were about to be tested in a way they had never imagined. One day, Runo woke up with a small cough and a slight fever. He managed it to work that morning, thinking it would clear off with time. But when he returned home that evening, Mimi noticed it. "You don't look well," she said, touching his forehead. "I am fine, my love," Runo reassured her with a smile. But his forehead felt warm. Mimi frowned. "You have a fever. Let me make you some herbal tea." Runo smiled. "You and your teas. But it's all right, I'll take it." Mimi prepared a steaming cup of ginger and honey tea. She also brought him some fruits and insisted he went to bed early. By the next morning, he felt much better. Mimi smiled. "You see, I told you my tea works." Runo laughed. "Maybe you should start a tea business." They joked about it, thinking it was just a minor illness. But then it happened again, and this time it lasted longer. Runo's cough worsened. His chest felt heavy. He often felt weak, and sometimes he struggled to catch his breath after climbing the stairs. One night, as they lay in bed, Mimi noticed that Runo was breathing heavily in his sleep. She shook him gently. "Runo," he stared and opened his eyes. "You're breathing so hard. Are you okay?" Runo sat up and rubbed his chest. "It's nothing, Mimi. I'm just a little tired." But Mimi didn't believe him. The next day, he went to work as usual. But by evening, when he returned home, he looked extremely exhausted. As he climbed the stairs, he suddenly paused and held the railing, gasping for air. Mimi's heart jumped in fear when she saw him. She rushed to him. "Runo, are you okay?" He forced a weak smile. "I'm fine, my love. I'm just tired." Mimi frowned. "This isn't normal anymore, Runo. You need to see a doctor." Runo shook his head. It is just stress. I'll be fine. But Mimi crossed her arms. Runo, I am your wife, and I won't sit back and watch you pretend that nothing is wrong. If you don't see a doctor, I will drag you there myself. Runo smiled. That's why I married you. You're so stubborn. Say whatever you want, but we are going to the hospital tomorrow morning. Reluctantly, Runo agreed. When they got to the hospital, the doctors ran several tests on Runo. Mimi sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. She had a bad feeling about this. Finally, the doctor returned with the results, but his expression was serious. Mr. Runo, I am afraid we have some bad news. Mimi's heart skipped a beat. What is it, doctor? She asked anxiously. The doctor exhaled deeply. Your husband has a heart condition. His arteries are narrowing, making it difficult for blood to flow properly. Mimi held her chest, horrified. Runo frowned. What does that mean? The doctor continued. It means that your heart is working harder than normal. Right now, it is still in the early stages, but if we don't intervene, it will worsen over time. Mimi felt cold fear crawl up her spine. Is there a cure? The doctor nodded. Yes, a simple surgery can correct the arteries before they become completely blocked. Runo's expression hardened. No. The doctor blinked. Excuse me? Runo shook his head. I don't need a surgery. I believe God will heal me. Mimi agreed with her husband. Yes, doctor, we believe God will heal him. The doctor looked confused. I understand faith, but this is a medical condition. Mimi interrupted. We don't believe in surgery that involves blood transfusions. The Bible says that life is in the blood and it belongs to God. I believe there are drugs that can cure it, right? The doctor sighed. I understand religious beliefs, but I must be honest with you. Medication will only slow down the condition, but it cannot cure it. Runo was firm. No surgery, doctor. Just give me the medication. The doctor hesitated. Are you sure? Yes, Runo confirmed. My life is in God, not in the hands of men. The doctor finally prescribed some drugs and gave them a list of healthy lifestyle changes. As they left the hospital, Mimi clung to Runo's arms. Something about the doctor's warning terrified her, and she feared that this might just be the beginning of something much worse. For the next few months, Runo followed the doctor's instructions. He took his medication faithfully, ate only the healthiest foods, and exercised daily. Mimi made sure that he didn't stress himself, cutting down his business meetings and ensuring he rested well. They also prayed harder than ever before. God is in control, Runo would say every night before they slept. Mimi nodded in agreement. Yes, he is. At first, everything seemed fine. Runo's energy improved, and he no longer had breathing difficulties. But then, 4 months later, it happened again. It was late at night when Mimi heard a loud crash from the bathroom. She jumped up from bed in fear. Runo, she called, but there was no answer. Fear gripped her as she ran towards the bathroom. When she pushed the door open, her blood ran cold. Runo was on the floor. His body was trembling. His hands held his chest tightly. His face was pale, and sweat poured down his forehead. Runo! She screamed and knelt beside him. He was struggling for air. His lips was moving, but no sound came out. Mimi's hands shook as she grabbed her phone and called an ambulance. Please, my husband can't breathe. Hurry. Tears covered her face as she cradled his head. Stay with me, my love. Please stay with me. Runo looked at her. His eyes were filled with pain and fear. I I love you, he whispered weakly before his body went still. No, no, Runo, wake up, wake up, Mimi cried as she shook him, begging God to save him. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived. The paramedics rushed in, checked his pulse, and immediately started CPR. He has no heartbeat, one of them shouted. Mimi collapsed into a chair, watching in horror as they worked to bring him back. Charging, clear. The defibrillator shocked Runo's chest, but nothing changed. Again, charging, clear. Runo's body jolted this time, and then suddenly there was a heartbeat. The paramedics sighed in relief. We have a pulse. Mimi burst into tears, thanking God as they lifted Runo onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital. Mimi paced the waiting room. Her mind was filled with terror and guilt. Had they made a mistake by refusing surgery? Was their faith really strong enough to withstand this? Finally, after what felt like hours, the doctor came out. His face was grave. Mrs. Mimi, your husband is stable, but his condition is getting worse. Mimi gripped her chest. What do we do now? The doctor exhaled deeply. I'll be direct with you. Runo needs surgery. If we don't operate now, his heart will keep failing, and next time, he may not survive. Mimi felt dizzy. She shook her head. No, there has to be another way. We can't touch our blood. The doctor sighed. There reasoned sadly. A familiar voice suddenly spoke up from behind. Well, there is another way. Mimi and the doctor turned to see a visiting consultant, an experienced heart surgeon who had just arrived at the hospital for a special case. There is a complicated but possible way to do the surgery, and it will be bloodless, since that is what you're concerned about, he explained. Mimi's eyes widened. A bloodless surgery? The doctor nodded. It is risky, but if that's what you want, we can try. Runo, who had been awake but weak, spoke softly. Yes, let's do it. Mimi squeezed his hand in relief. Thank you, doctor, thank you. She believed that this was God answering their prayers. But what she did not know was that fate had other plans for them. The day of the surgery soon arrived. Runo was taken into the operating room, while Mimi sat outside praying harder than she had ever prayed before. She held her Bible tightly, rocking back and forth. Lord, please let this work. Please save my husband. Don't let me lose him. Hours passed, and then suddenly alarms started ringing inside the operating room. Mimi's head flew up. Several nurses ran in and out of the room. Their faces were tense and filled with panic. What is happening? She cried, running to the door. A nurse blocked her way. Please, ma'am, stay here. Mimi's entire body trembled. Something was wrong. She could sense it. Finally, the consultant walked out to meet her. Madam, we have a problem. Mimi's heart dropped. What is it? She whispered. The doctor sighed. The bloodless surgery isn't working. Your husband's heart is failing rapidly. If we don't do a proper surgery right now, including a blood transfusion, he will die. Mimi froze. Her mind ran around in chaos. A blood transfusion? They had spent their whole lives believing that blood was sacred, that it was against God's will to take another person's blood. She had promised Runo that she would never let that happen. But now, if she didn't, he would die. Tears poured down her face. No, there has to be another way. The doctor shook his head. There isn't. Mimi pressed her hands against her mouth, shaking violently. What should she do? She could see her entire world crashing down. Then a nurse called out at that moment, Doctor, his pulse is dropping fast. Mimi turned and saw through the glass window. Runo was slipping away. The heart monitor beeped dangerously. He was dying. Mimi's entire body went cold. She had prayed. She had believed. She had held on to faith. But now, she had no choice. With a deep, trembling breath, she turned to the doctor. Save him. The doctor looked at her. That means we should go ahead with the blood transfusion. Mimi closed her eyes. Tears ran down her cheeks. Do whatever you need to do. Just save my husband. Hours later, the surgery was over. Mimi sat outside, numb and exhausted. The doctor finally walked out. The surgery was successful. Runo is out of danger. Mimi let out a choked cry of relief. She rushed into the room and saw him lying there, awake but weak. He opened his eyes, and when he saw her, he smiled. Mimi, his voice was soft. God saved us. Mimi forced a smile, but inside, she was breaking. She couldn't tell him the truth, at least not yet. She met the doctor outside. Please, don't tell him about the transfusion. Let me do it myself. The doctor hesitated but nodded. Mimi went back in and sat beside Runo. She had saved him, but she had also betrayed his trust. And when he finds out, would he ever forgive her? Runo's recovery was slow but steady. Mimi remained by his side every second, watching over him and praying with him. Every time he opened his eyes, she smiled and reassured him, "You are going to be fine, my love." And he would smile back, weak but filled with faith. The Lord has been faithful. I knew he would never abandon me. Mimi swallowed hard. She nodded, but her heart was heavy. Runo still believed that God had saved him the way they had prayed for, without breaking their faith. He didn't know the truth. He didn't know that in the final moments of his surgery, she had made a choice that went against everything they believed in. Mimi knew she couldn't keep it from him forever. But how was she going to tell him? Would he understand? Or would he hate her forever? For now, she stayed silent. 2 weeks after the surgery, Runo was discharged from the hospital. The doctors warned him to take things slowly, to avoid stress, and to continue his medication. Mimi made sure that everything was perfect for his return. She redecorated their bedroom with soft colors, fresh flowers, and warm blankets. She stocked up on healthy meals and made sure their home was peaceful. When they arrived, Runo giggled happily. "It feels good to be home." Mimi smiled. Yes. She helped him into bed, tucking him in like a child. As she sat beside him, she knew it was time. She took a deep breath. "Runo, there is something I need to tell you." He turned his head to her. "What is it, my love?" Her throat felt dry. She opened her mouth, but hesitated. Runo reached out for her hand. "Mimi." She squeezed his hand and whispered, "The surgery, it wasn't the way we expected." His brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" She took another breath. "The bloodless surgery, it wasn't working." Runo sat up slightly. "What are you saying, Mimi?" Mimi's heart pounded. "The doctor said you wouldn't make it. They said the only way to save you was through a proper surgery with a blood transfusion." The room fell into dead silence. Runo froze. His eyes widened as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "What did you say?" he whispered. Mimi's hands trembled. "They had to give you blood to save your life." For a moment, Runo didn't move. Then, slowly, he pulled his hand away from hers. "No," he whispered. Mimi's lips quivered. "Runo, please." Runo's face twisted in horror and disbelief. "No, no, This can't be true. Tears were already dropping from Mimi's eyes. I had no choice. You were dying. Runo shook his head violently. His breathing became rapid. You let them do it? You let them put someone else's blood into my body? Mimi cried. Runo, if I hadn't, you would be dead. Runo got up from the bed, staggering slightly as his chest rose and fell in rage. You betrayed me, Mimi. You betrayed our faith. Mimi fell to her knees, begging. I didn't want to lose you. I love you. Runo stepped back. His face was now filled with something worse than anger. It was disgust and dread. You stole my chance at heaven, he whispered. Mimi shook her head. Runo, no, don't say that. Runo's jaw clenched. You went against God's will. You went against me. Mimi cried uncontrollably. I did it to save you. Runo's eyes went cold. You should have let me die. Mimi froze. Runo, no. Without another word, he stormed out of the room. Mimi collapsed onto the floor, shaking with grief. She had saved his life, but in doing so, she didn't know she would lose him. Runo refused to speak to Mimi after that day. He moved into the guest room, locking himself away from her. He barely ate. He barely slept. Mimi tried everything. She sent him messages, left notes by his door. She even fasted and prayed for him. But Runo ignored her. To him, she was no longer his wife. She was a woman who had betrayed God. She was a woman who had stolen his chance of going to heaven. One evening, Mimi found him sitting alone in the garden, staring at the sky. She gathered her courage and sat beside him. Runo, please talk to me. But he remained silent. Mimi wiped her tears. I miss you. She grabbed his hand. Runo, I know you are hurting, but I did what I had to do. I couldn't watch you die. Runo pulled his hand away. His voice was cold. You made a choice, Mimi, and now I am making mine. Mimi's heart shattered. Runo, please. I don't hate you, he interrupted, but I can't be with someone who doesn't share my faith. Mimi felt like she couldn't breathe. Are you saying you're leaving me? Runo clenched his jaw. I already have. Mimi burst into tears, covering her face. I love you, Runo. But Runo's expression didn't change. Love is not enough. Then he stood up and walked away. Mimi collapsed onto the grass, crying uncontrollably. Her husband was alive, but her marriage was dead. Weeks passed, months passed, but Runo continued to shut her out. Mimi fell into deep depression. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She spent her days crying, regretting, and wishing she had never made that decision. Then, one morning, she couldn't take it anymore. She walked to a pharmacy and bought a bottle of sleeping pills. Then, she went home, sat on their bed, the bed she used to share with the man she loved, and swallowed every pill in the bottle. As the darkness took over, she said her last prayer, Lord, forgive me. Then everything went black. Runo was on his way out when something felt wrong. The house was unusually quiet. His heart pounded violently as a strange fear gripped him. He turned back and walked towards the bedroom. When he pushed the door open, he saw Mimi's lifeless body on the bed. His entire world stopped. Mimi, she didn't move. Then he saw the empty bottle of pills beside her. His blood ran cold. No, 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 no. He ran to her, shaking her frantically. Mimi, wake up! Please, wake up! But she was still. Tears poured down his face as he scooped her into his arms and ran outside. "Somebody help me!" he screamed. He opened the car door, placed her inside, and sped to the hospital. His hands shook as he held the steering tightly. "Hold on, Mimi, please. Don't leave me." And for the first time in months, he prayed for her. He had been buried with praying for God's forgiveness for months. That he hadn't even remembered Mimi. For months, he had ignored her and had let his anger punish her. But now, she was slipping away from him. "God, please, don't let me lose her. Please, Lord, don't take her from me." As he pulled up to the hospital, he jumped out and carried her inside. "Help! Somebody help me!" Nurses rushed to him, and a doctor immediately called for emergency treatment. Runo was pushed aside as they laid Mimi on a stretcher and wheeled her away. His knees gave way, and he collapsed onto the chair in the waiting room. He had done this. He had pushed her to the edge, and now he might never get the chance to say "I'm sorry." Minutes felt like hours until finally the doctor walked in, looking gloomy. "Mr. Runo, the toxin spread fast. We've done everything we can, but she's in critical condition." Runo swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. "What does that mean?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "She has less than a 20% chance of survival." The words hit Runo like a hammer to his chest. His hands shook violently. His heart pounded. "No, no, no, no." The doctor continued. "I'm sorry, but now it is up to her body to fight." Runo grabbed the doctor's arm. "She will fight, won't she? She's strong. She's in a coma, Mr. Runo." The doctor dropped the bombshell. Runo felt the words spinning around him. "A coma? She may never wake up." His knees shook violently and he collapsed onto the cold hospital floor. "Mimi!" He buried his face in his hands and cried bitterly. For the first time in months, Runo realized something terrifying. He had been praying for God to forgive him, but he had refused to forgive his own wife. And now she might die believing he hated her. "God, please, give me one more chance, please." For 2 weeks, Mimi remained in a deep coma. Runo never left her side. He sat by her bed holding her hand and whispering apologies over and over again. "I am so sorry, my love. I was wrong. I was so wrong." He wiped away his tears that never seemed to stop. He had wasted so much time being angry, so much time punishing the woman who had only ever loved him. Now, she couldn't even hear him. He read her favorite Bible verses to her, hoping she could feel his presence. He talked about their memories, their wedding, their first dates, their experiences, their love. Every night, he knelt beside her bed and prayed for a miracle. "Lord, don't let this be the end of our story." But nothing changed. Day after day, she remained lifeless. And every night, Runo lost a little more hope. However, on the 15th day, something happened. Runo had just finished praying when he felt movement. His head snapped up. He saw Mimi's fingers twitched. Then her eyelids fluttered. "Mimi!" he called desperately. Her lips parted slightly. Then finally, her eyes slowly opened. Runo panted heavily, pressing the nurse's call button. "Mimi, my love, can you hear me?" Her gaze was unfocused, but then her eyes met his. A doctor rushed into the room. "She's awake." Mimi blinked weakly. "Runo." Her voice was coarse. But to Runo, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. He grabbed her hand and kissed it. "Yes, my love, I am here, I am here." The doctor quickly attended to her, and when she was more stable, Runo came in to meet her. He couldn't control his tears as he sat beside her. "Thank you, God, thank you." Mimi looked at him tiredly.